Hi, it's Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me. And today we are going to do a little bit of a mini masterclass on compression as it applies to mastering. And we're going to go deeper than just regular compression. We're going to take a really close look specifically at multiband compression and dynamic EQ in mastering. But you also get some great notes on just general regular compression in mastering. I have some tracks pulled up here that we can listen to together to hear some of these concepts in action. But before we get into listening to some stuff together, I just wanted to give you an overall framework for thinking about how to use these tools in mastering. And then we'll get into some real audio examples of these exact ideas. This one is totally free to the public thanks to our sponsors over at fabfilter. Fabfilter makes some of my favorite plugins out there. Super intuitive, easy to use, pretty to look at, and good sounding. If you haven't tried out their stuff, go over to fabfilter.com where you can try out anything they make for free. They have a whole bunch of great tools for dynamic control in mastering and mixing. I've got the Pro C2 compressor pulled up here. Super flexible compressor that does pretty much everything you need it to. And we've got the Pro MB, which is their multiband compressor. But another tool that I don't have pulled up here that has a compressor in it is their Pro Q3 EQ. This EQ has dynamic EQ built into it, and dynamic EQ is a kind of compression, and we'll be looking at approaches to using those in mastering as well. But before we get into those more advanced types of compression, I just want to give you some general notes on using compression in mastering. I'll give you not only my approach, but the approach of some of the best mastering engineers out there. I've interviewed a ton of the top mastering engineers in the world. And although each of them has a different approach, a different style, there are some common themes that come up. And there are some particular mastering engineers who are very, very light-handed with compression on their masters. It's not a tool that they lean on heavily, particularly not for dynamic range control, more for kind of tonal reasons than compression reasons. Certain analog pieces of hardware and plug-in emulations of them have a little bit of a box tone of their own. Without doing significant amounts of compression, you might get little bits of added color from those compressors. There are other mastering engineers who might use slightly more significant amounts of compression, but it really depends, at least in my world, on the material that's coming in. I have to admit right off the bat that some of the best sounding masters I do sound as good as they do because they come from the best sounding mixes that were sent in. And often on those best sounding mixes that are sent in, the mixing engineer is using appropriate amounts of compression for their style, for their genre. They're probably using some type of mixbus compressor, or maybe they're doing some type of multi-bus compression before they hit their mixbus. And they've got the dynamic control and the tone and shape of compression already dialed into their mix. And it's not my job to add more compression. It's my job to double check things, maybe scoot up or down the highs and lows a tiny bit to fit a little bit better with other records in the same style and make sure that one song flows into the other really well. But on those kinds of records, which are often the kinds of records that some of the best people working today get a lot of, the whole point is to be really minimal compression and maybe do very little, if at all. But I also have some newer clients who are a little bit more cautious about digging in with enough compression that would be appropriate for the style that they're working in. And it's actually my job at that point to say, hey, I'm going to throw on some of the bus compression that you probably should have, would have, and could have thrown on your mix bus. So I might dig in a little bit harder than some of the best mastering engineers in the world might do on the best mixes in the world, where the overall amount of compression is already dialed in and is already in a good place. So that's something to think about. There are certain projects in mastering that really demand from you to do basically no compression. And there are certain releases where to get the record sounding closer to like the actual sound of all their favorite releases, I've got to dig in more than you're supposed to. When I do have to use somewhat significant amounts of compression, though, there's a few little tricks that I often use to make it so that that compression isn't too heavy-handed, isn't too overbearing, and is making things sound better rather than worse. And those tricks basically are stacking compressors using two compressors, each to do a little bit of compression, and each usually with slightly different attack and release settings, and multiband compression or dynamic EQ, which allows us to target in greater amounts of compression just on the areas where we need it to happen. So we're not using tons of extra compression on the entire mix when what really needs a little bit of extra compression is just the kick drum or just the vocal or just some harsh guitars or cymbals in the top end. There, dynamic EQ, which is a type of compressor, and multiband compression can allow us to dig in a little bit more while making less of a mess of things. And I've got to tell you, both of these approaches, the minimal approach, and on some records, the slightly more heavy-handed approach, either approach can make clients really happy. And I've had clients where I've been heavy-handed and they said, "Oh my goodness, thank you. It sounds so much better than I sent it into you." And it's like, yeah, that's because I did some of those things you were afraid to do. And I broke a bunch of the rules in the mastering handbook. And I hope to give you some ideas on how to break those rules as well if you have to, and how to be subtle and be a minimalist when you should be doing that as well. All right, let's get into some of the broad conceptual ideas. First idea, number one, is that when you're applying conventional regular broadband compression, you're probably going to apply it in much of the same way as you would a bus compressor. So this generally means ratios of 2-to-1. That kind of thing is going to be more common in mastering than much higher ratios. 2-to-1, 2.5-to-1, maybe as high as 3-to-1, sometimes even a little bit less than 2-to-1. And we're often trying to compress things so the compressor isn't engaged all the time, that it's just clamping down occasionally. But one of the other big things you've got to think about here are attack and release times. And I think attack is the most important next parameter to listen for in your mixes. And one of the questions that I ask myself when I start fiddling around with a compressor in mastering is, why am I putting this compressor on? What am I looking to achieve? And there are generally two things that I'm looking to achieve with a compressor. One is that I'm looking for a little bit more vibrance and life out of the track. Or two, I'm looking for a little bit more smoothness and control out of the track. There are a whole bunch of other ideas I can throw in there, but those are the first two questions I ask when it comes to the compressor. Why am I putting it on? Is it because the track sounds kind of dull? Maybe it was actually overcompressed at the mixbus stage with a super fast attack compressor. We're losing some of the transients, we're losing some detail, and we want to bring some of that articulation, some of that transient information and initial impact back. We're trying to have the song jump out at you a little bit more. In that case, I might think about starting with compression that is on the slower attack side and that has a faster release. Slower attacks are going to allow more transients to get through, more initial impacts to get through relative to the rest of the content. So we get things kind of jumping out at you a little bit more. We get things getting slightly more articulate, slightly brighter and clearer without applying EQ. And then the kind of faster release, maybe medium to medium fast release, is also helping add some kind of vibrance and excitement to the track. So if I'm looking to bring out a little bit more detail, a little bit more hype, make things sound a little bit more exciting and forward, that might be a place to start. Relatively slower attack side, relatively faster release side. What's a slow attack? I would say that anywhere in the range of 20 milliseconds to 60 millisecond attack times, depending on the compressor, can be a decent way to think about starting with slower attack times on compressors. What's a fast, medium, fast release time? Anywhere maybe as fast as 35 milliseconds to as slow as 70 or so milliseconds. That kind of range helps bring out some detail, some perceived loudness, some extra little bit of excitement. If you go too fast with a release time, things can start to get a little bit more kind of trashy sounding and dirty sounding. And if you go too slow with the release time, things can start to get maybe a little bit more veiled and a little bit more sluggish feeling. You can almost accentuate the bounce and the pulse of the track with a little bit of compression with a fastish to medium fastish release time. If you go too slow with your attack time, you don't really get the dynamic control you're maybe looking for out of your compressor. And things can actually sound even sloppier and messier potentially if you inappropriately use a slower attack time. On the other hand, if you set your attack time too fast, you can start to get a slightly more kind of veiled sound where you're starting to lose transient, you're starting to lose detail, impact, and excitement. But there is a significant number of tracks where I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to think about using a faster attack on my compressor. And in these cases, it's usually because I'm getting material that's a little bit undercompressed, that maybe the person who is mixing it was a little bit too timid to apply an appropriate amount of compression for their genre or style, or maybe the players on that particular release had a little bit less dynamic control than was ideal. So if I'm hearing things like drums and acoustic guitars that are kind of like poking out a little bit more than they should, maybe they have too much transient on them, and that transient is kind of fluctuating a little bit too much. We're getting this kind of uncontrolled and sloppy feel out of the track. I might skew towards using a faster attack compressor. And again, I'd probably use fast-ish, medium fast-ish releases to start with. So that compressor is just kind of tamping down on peaks and letting go, and is acting a little bit like a limiter does, but a really soft limiter. Instead of it being, brick wall where nothing gets past, maybe there's a ratio of 3-to-1 on that compressor. How fast is a fast attack compressor? I'd say, anywhere from 0 milliseconds to 4 milliseconds on the attack time. I'll often, if something feels really uncontrolled and sloppy, err more towards the 1 millisecond and less. And if something just needs a tiny bit more control without overdoing it, maybe I'm veering more towards 1 millisecond and more on the fast attack compressor. And on those tracks that really do need a little bit more compression than I generally would ideally want to do, I'll often use 2 compressors. One really fast attack one that's controlling those transients, and then that one will go into a second slower attack compressor that's now letting those controlled transients through and back out. So sometimes slower attack compressors can almost act like uncompressors, allowing some of the transient detail and initial impact that's been overly smoothed out by too much compression to kind of come back. And this idea of stacking compressors can be really useful when you need to do a little bit more compression than you feel like you can get away with on just one compressor. Ideally, in a mastering context, though, this kind of thing that I'm talking about is pretty subtle. And playing you before and afters of this stuff, if you're listening on a laptop or earbuds, maybe something that you kind of struggle to really hear very consciously until you've trained your ears to notice what kinds of differences compressors make. Hearing just a half a dB or a dB or even 2 dB of compression can feel really, really subtle until you've trained your ears to hear it. But I think that it really changes potentially the impact of the song on an emotional level over long periods of time. Which brings me to another really important thing to think about when it comes to compression in the mastering context. Big takeaway number 2, compression in mastering is not your most powerful tool. The most significant changes you're going to make in mastering, when you need to make them, often come from things like EQ. And sometimes in mastering, when you're applying enough compression for it to really make a significant sonic difference where the average person is going to hear it in a quick sip test in and out of bypass, you might already at that point be starting to apply too much compression for a lot of mastering contexts. So we're kind of in this weird place with compression where by the time you're really consciously, audibly hearing it in a significant way, it's probably too much and you're probably most of the time doing more harm than good. Really, one of the best uses of compression in mastering is to solve problems with things like multiband compression and dynamic EQ. People get a little bit scared of these tools because they seem like really advanced and like they're going to do too much and it's like too much weird processing for your audio. But for me, it's exactly the opposite. Using multiband compression and dynamic EQ properly allows you to target in your compression so you're only applying compression where you need it, allowing you to dig in a little bit harder with the compressor just in the places that need it without getting quite so many artifacts and side effects and without the compression becoming too audible. If you're really focusing your compression just in the area where it needs to add extra control, you can potentially dig in a little bit more and do a little bit more while still staying really transparent and not messing things up. Not only do multiband compression and dynamic EQ allow you to apply compression where you need it, multiband compression and dynamic EQ allow you to apply EQ when you need it. So you're not using significant cuts or boosts in EQ all of the time. You're just applying your slightly more significant cuts and boosts of EQ when they're needed. In those moments where you need a little bit of an extra bass boost or a little bit of an extra bass duck, you're going to apply that momentarily using multiband compression or dynamic EQ. There are so many different places where you can use these tools, but I'll give you right off the bat the three most common places that I will reach for a multiband compressor or a dynamic EQ. One is low end. There's going to be either a kick instrument or a bass instrument that, say, is a little bit overbearing and a little bit dominant. And I really want to cut a little bit of the area where that one instrument is. Say it's the kick drum. There's just too much low-end buildup on the kick drum. I might need to suck down that kick drum when it hits, but only when it hits. Because if I start dipping down, say 60 hertz or 80 hertz too significantly, now I'm taking all the low end out of the bass and say some low toms that happen in the song. And I don't want to do that. I really want to focus as much as possible of targeting that cut precisely on that kick drum. Or it could be exactly the opposite. Maybe the bass is in a good place on the record, but the kick drum, it just doesn't have as much sub energy. So I want to bring the subs up on the kick drum, but I only want that to happen when the kick is hitting. Using something like a dynamic EQ or a multiband compressor can do that as well. Technically, when we're doing that, we're using it in a multiband expansion mode. But most multiband compressors, like the Pro MB from FabFilter, have exactly that functionality built in. The second most common application for me for multiband compression or dynamic EQ is in the top end, particularly on things like cymbals and on vocals, where you'd use it almost a little bit like a de-esser. You might have certain cymbals that just poke out a little bit too much once the track gets to an appropriate level of brightness. So you might want to brighten up the track overall, but you're finding that in the top end, everything sounds great except these cymbals are poking out too much. So you can have an EQ boost that also ducks down the cymbals just when the cymbals are overly dominant in that same region. The exact same kind of thing can happen with sibilance on a vocal, or with maybe acoustic guitars or other elements that jump out a little bit too much. The last place that I'll commonly use multiband compressors or dynamic EQs is in the mid-range. And this could be either on a really harsh guitar or harsh synthesizer where we want to go in and just help duck down maybe the initial attack and transient edge just in one specific mid-range area, 1.5K, 2K, 3K, or some common offenders. So we might dip down areas there without putting a whole big hole of EQ in our mix. It's only going to duck down when frequencies in that area get overbearing. Or it might be to add a little bit more dynamic control to a vocal. Other things in the mix are decently well dynamically controlled, but maybe the vocal just should have been ridden a little bit more at the mixing stage or could have used a little bit more compression at the mixing stage. We can kind of focus in our compression just to the vocal range, giving a little bit of extra compression to the mid-range without messing with too much additional compression in the lows and highs. So that's really the idea, using these compression and dynamic range manipulation tools so you can be more subtle with your EQ moves and more subtle with your compression. If just the vocal on the track needs a little bit of extra compression, you don't have to compress the whole track. You can just compress the vocal range. If the kick drum or the bass pokes out a little bit too much occasionally in one area, you can just dip that area down when it gets overbearing because of that instrument. Or you can do exactly the opposite, expansion in the lows, expansion in the highs, expansion in the mids, to let certain elements jump out a little bit more than they are already. All right, that's enough talking about these ideas. Let's get in here and start hearing them on some actual tracks. Now, before we get into it too deeply, I want to give a little caveat, which is I've actually been putting off doing this video for a while because the reality is that compression in appropriate amounts for mastering can be kind of hard to hear. Even if you're really well trained in listening for compression, good mastering compression isn't supposed to be overly audible. It's not like an effect. And if you're not really well trained to listen for compression, well, then it's going to be even harder to hear some of these subtle changes that I think really do and can make a significant emotional impact on the song. Any compression examples that I play you where you can really hear a significant before and after, like night and day difference, often those are going to be examples of probably too much compression for mastering. And that's one of the additional reasons I wanted to focus in with you on looking a little bit more at multiband compression and at dynamic EQ, because there's this EQ component to the compression as well. And if we're using them to a little bit reshape the EQ curve of the song, that might be a little bit more audible to you, whether you have or haven't really fine-tuned your ears to hear compression. But I also have a little exercise in here to help you start tuning your ears for listening for the kinds of things that compression does to any type of sound source. To give you a really quick, exaggerated example of what this idea sounds like, the difference between your slower attack compression, letting through more transients, more initial impact, and your faster attack compression that's smoothing things out a little bit more, I'm going to play a couple of snare drum samples for you back to back. These two snare drums, even though they sound significantly different from one another, are the same exact snare drum sample, just with completely different settings applied. First, we'll hear one with a really fast attack time and a really fast release, and then we'll hear one with a slow attack time and a slightly longer release. I think you'll hear a big difference here. Those two almost sound like two totally different instruments, right? I've got some listening exercises like this where we go even deeper in the compression breakthroughs course. So if you want to get a full handle on really hearing the nuances and differences between different types of compressors and compressor settings, I'd encourage you to check out compression breakthroughs, where we do like 9 or 10 hours of fooling around with compressors together, listening to them and really learning to hear them and use them like a pro. But for today's purposes, I want to keep it a little bit conceptual, a little bit high level for you. And on some of these audio examples we'll hear in just a minute, we'll be listening to a little bit more of the multi-band compression approaches and dynamic EQ approaches, where I think you're going to more easily hear more significant differences. All right, I've got a cool track here from an artist called Maydenfeld. A producer named JJ who lives out in Tokyo, Japan, sent this one to me. And this was his original mix here. And I've done a quick light master to it using nothing but just a tiny touch of multi-band compression just in the lows and highs, so you can hear exactly what kind of effect this has. We'll talk about what kind of settings I have going on these in just a minute. But first, let's hear the track before I've done anything to it. I'll drop us off here in a verse. Really beautiful mix here from JJ, and I've got to say, the balances are really nice. It feels nice and full and supple. But in comparing it to some of his favorite sounding records in this style, it had maybe just a little bit more bottom end, kind of in the low subs. And I felt it could stand to be tightened up just a little bit. But I didn't want to get overly harsh and bright in doing so. I think this becomes more significant in these instrumental chorus sections, where we have some really pounding stuff going on the low end. Let's hear that. So that to me, just a little bit too beefy down in the way bottom, which is a super common thing to happen in otherwise really good mixes. You have a mixer who did an absolutely great job getting the overall balances right, but just the amount of low end and extreme top end could be a little bit too much or a little bit too little. And that's kind of the mastering engineer's job, to double check those things a little bit. And in this case, I wanted to tighten up that bottom end a little bit, but without losing the oomph on the bottom of the kick drum. The only thing that's going on here on this unmastered track is there's a little bit of the Pro L2 happening just to bring its level up. And I'm not doing a ton for this genre. The loudness that this limiter is doing, I think I just have it set to -8 or so LUFS, which is not super hot for kind of an electronic pop track. But with this much bottom end going on, it's going to be hard to get it that much louder. You may hear the compressor sucking down a little bit on the kick drum. Part of that's a stylistic choice that's in there in the mix, kind of as an effect, and is not uncommon in this style. And a tiny bit of that is being added from the additional limiting here. Let's just see what this original unmastered mix is doing to the limiter. So not a crazy amount of limiting going on here at all, but we really could tighten this up just a little bit in this one section to give it the kind of impact it should have. Over here on this second track below it, the only thing I have going on is the same amount of limiting, but this time I'm putting the Pro MB multiband compressor before we hit that limiter. And I actually have the low end working here in an expansion mode where we are taking down the low end a little bit, but then each time the kick hits, it's allowing that low end to come back for just a moment on each kick hit. So we get to remove the subs overall, but bring back in a tiny bit of sub just for an instant on the initial impact of each kick hit. So we're able to get more controlled lows without completely taking away the subs in the kick drum. As we start to gently roll off some of these lows below 100 Hertz, it's going to make the overall track feel a tiny bit brighter. So to compensate for that, we've got a little bit of a gentle compressor happening in the upper frequencies to keep them from getting out of control as things get a little bit brighter. So some of the highest frequency elements in the track are going to be compressed just a little bit to keep them from getting out of hand. I'll put this off to the side real quick, and we will hear a quick before and after. Here's the original unmastered version up here, and here it is practically unmastered with just a little bit of the Pro MB on it. First, starting with before. So it's pretty amazing what such a small move with a multiband compressor can do. We're cutting lows by about 2 dB here, which is significant, giving us that brighter, tighter feel, but we're making sure some of those lows come back on the kick. But we could also do the same kind of thing with a dynamic EQ. Here, I'll just engage the Pro Q3 from fabfilter. And I have the same kind of thing going on here, a little bit more of an EQ curve now, but in the low end, we have a little bit of an upward expander, and in the high frequencies, a little bit of downward compression. Let's hear the before and after with just the EQ. Here's the before. So again, a lot tighter with fairly minimal EQ changes happening, some of them being dynamic in the lows and highs. Now, if you want to hear standard compression, that's going to be a little bit more subtle. Let's bring it into a less processed section like this verse here. I'll turn off the Pro Q3. And just so we're not overloading our compressor with low end, I'll turn back on this multiband compressor. And here is our Pro C2 compressor. And in amounts that are appropriate in a mastering context, it shouldn't be that obvious. Let's hear a quick before and after with this compressor turned off and on. Let's hear a quick before and after where we will hear the original and then with a multiband compressor, and then we'll add this broadband compressor on top of it. Here we go. So for me, with this subtle amount of compression, and it's less than a half a dB, is bringing a little bit more snap and articulation into the sound. Is that just my ears playing tricks on me? I don't think so. I think I'm hearing a little bit of a tonal change here. But let's make this a little bit more extreme so that you can train your ear to listen for this kind of thing by hearing way too much compression applied. I'll go ahead and put this into the auto gain setting so it'll automatically compensate for the gain reduction we're doing. Here it is before, then after, and then we'll hear it with increasing amounts of compression. Here we go.
You are, it feels I cannot shake. As you draw a breath I cannot take. I know I'll never let you go. Show me your killer star.
So that's what a lot of compression sounds like with a slow attack and a faster release. And I can just feel a little bit more of the details on those initial percussion hits jump out just a little bit more. We're still not doing an insane amount of compression, but more than you do in most mastering contexts. Let's hear it again, this time with too much really fast compression. Hear what that sounds like. Here it is first in bypass.
You are, it feels I cannot shake. As you draw a breath I cannot take. I know I'll never let you go. Show me your killer star. So go play, go set your stage on fire. Go play, don't ever hide your shine away. Feel safe, you're home now in these arms.
So this is way more compression than you'd normally use in a mastering context, but by doing these kinds of exercises where you push things a little bit too far, that's where you get to start to hear some of these differences, which can be a little bit subtle. But for me, we're hearing significant changes in the envelope of the percussion in the track, just how much attack we have compared to how much sustain we have in some of those percussion elements. And when we're doing a lot of this really fast attack compression at the same loudness reading on the meters, the track can sound even louder to us. But that can come at the cost of some detail and some clarity. Now, based on the feedback I gave to JJ and the before and afters that he heard in my final master, he sent in a revised mix that sounds even better than his original mix, and possibly sounds even better than the mastered version I did for him. So the final master we do on this track, based on the latest version of his mix, is likely to sound better than anything we've heard so far here today. And I think that's something you should think about in your own mixes and masters. If, as a mastering engineer, you have to go in really heavily with things like multiband compression and EQ, maybe you're better off giving the client mix notes. But in the case of this track, I think JJ did a great enough job to begin with that he didn't even need to necessarily send over a revised mix, and the changes we're making here aren't really big. I hope some of these general ideas were useful to you. The best thing you can do is start playing around with these ideas for yourself. Try going ahead and cutting some frequencies and using multiband expansion to bring those frequencies back up on target instruments, or do exactly the opposite. Focus in on one target instrument in a master that's poking out too much and use downward multiband compression or dynamic EQ to try to control it a little bit better. You can often get away with slightly more significant amounts of EQ or compression out of a multiband compressor or out of a dynamic EQ before it starts to be too much and before it starts to kind of ruin things, as long as you're really intentional and focused about where you're putting these things. Well, I hope this one was useful to you. Let me know in the comments down below, where are your favorite places to put dynamic EQs and multiband compressors on a master, and how do you approach general compression and limiting on mastering projects? I always love to hear from you on these things, so definitely hit the comment section and I'll be reading them. Thanks again to FabFilter for helping us make this one free to the public. They make absolutely great tools. Could I master an entire song using nothing but FabFilter plugins? Basically, yeah, and I've done it here in this demonstration video and in others as well. Just really fun, intuitive tools to work with that are extremely powerful, flexible, and just sound damn good and are pretty to look at. So check them out and try out anything they make for free over at fabfilter.com. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.